Hello and welcome to a new backcountry snowpack summary for the North Shore Mountains, brought to you by North Shore Rescue on Friday, January 14, 2022. Last time we spoke, there was a crust on the surface, the skiing wasn't all that great, and surprisingly enough, 200 millimeters of rain this week did nothing to improve the conditions too much. Now, the crust did get buried with actually nice snow over the last weekend, and then of course the atmospheric river kicked in and we got copious amounts of rain on Tuesday and Wednesday, spreading widespread avalanche activity, mostly wet, loose avalanches running on the crust that was immediately below on the North Shore. So we were taking advantage of these subpar conditions for skiing and take the advantage of that to practice what we don't really ever can do too much of, and that's companion rescue. Before we talk about the snowpack, I'd like to take a second to discuss how to interpret the avalanche hazard scale. Now, of course, Avalanche Canada does a pretty good job at explaining that on their website, and most of us have never been buried in an avalanche. So I'd like to take a different angle and use somewhat of a lowest common denominator of threat to your well-being, and that, of course, is diarrhea. So imagine that you go to an all-you-can-eat restaurant, and above the buffet you notice a big green sign, and it says, "Today's E. coli hazard rating, low." And okay, well, that's great. That's what I want to hear, right? So you wash your hands, you apply the 3-second rule to anything you drop onto the floor, and you're good to go. Now, the food is really good, so the next day you decide to go again. But on that day, the sign has changed. It's now yellow and it says moderate. Now, you could decide to just dig in and hope for the best. However, that doesn't really seem like the sensible thing to do. You'd probably want to poke your head in the kitchen and talk to the chef and go, "Hey, what gives? Like, why are you saying moderate?" And then he tells you, "Oh, it's the chicken, man. It's like, stay away from the chicken." Okay, well, that's good information. Now, the moderate rating can mean two things. Either there's only chicken in a few dishes and it's easy to steer clear of them, or there's chicken in just about everything, however, the chicken is probably okay. So in the avalanche world, what just happened here is that you saw the bulletin with the hazard rating of moderate, and then you clicked on the tab that says problem and details, and you analyzed that information. And then you either had the dodgy chicken that's isolated, so that would be something like, wind slabs close to ridge top on west aspect, and that gives you your moderate rating. Or you could have this chicken that's everywhere, and that would be like storm slabs that is shallow and soft on all aspects and all elevation. Still leads to a moderate hazard, but your approach to it and how you're going to manage that hazard might be a little bit different. So when you get to the trailhead, what you want to ask your partners is, okay, so where's the dodgy chicken? Like, how do we manage to stay away from it? And then you pull your map and you look at aspects and elevation, and you balance that against what you've learned in the avalanche bulletin, and you decide whether or not the route yet you're planning on today is sensible. Now you go back to that restaurant for some reason, and now you have a new sign. It's orange and it says considerable. I go, ooh, I don't like the sound of that. So you poke your head in the kitchen again, and the chef tells you, "Buddy, everything's dodgy. Like, the salad bar is probably fine, but I wouldn't touch anything else." I said, okay, well, the salad bar in this case in avalanche terrain would be, low angle terrain in the trees, ridge lines, small slopes that are free of terrain trap and away from the hazard that they talk about in the bulletin, that sort of stuff. In this case, most of the terrain is off limits, so it makes sense to focus mostly on the only places that you actually can go. Again, you pull out your map and you decide whether or not the plan that you had for today is a sensible one. You go back to the restaurant and now the sign is red and it says hi on it. Well, you may decide to talk to the chef, but really honestly, just do yourself a favor, find yourself a vending machine, get a Twix and a bag of chips and call it dinner. Essentially, stay away from avalanche terrain. Now, if you want to see what kind of damage 200 millimeters of rain can do to a snowpack, stick around for the snowpack discussion. For our profile this week, we picked an area at 1,100 meters on Habrick Ridge, essentially on flat ground on a rock slab. And the first thing that was a bit of a surprise is just how little snow we have here. So in this site, we only have just over 120 centimeters on the ground, which really goes to show that we have to be very careful when we take a profile like this and extrapolate what we gain from it to the whole area, because of course the snowpack is extremely variable. That said, one thing that seems to be fairly consistent across the snowpack right now is just how much moisture there is. So what we have here on the surface is really, really wet snow. The crust that was on the surface last week is barely visible anymore in this site. In other places it's still quite present. But it has broken down quite a bit, and we can tell that this crust actually somewhat stopped the movement of water down into the snowpack. But even when you get down into this level, the snow that's down here is still very wet. There's quite a bit of liquid water still in there. And we have another crust down here, which might be the December 23rd or somewhere, late December crust. That still further blocked a little bit of the water traveling down, yet still below that level, there's still a lot of water available, all the way down to probably what's here is the early December crusts. So definitely not a typical snowpack for January, and now we have to think about avalanches a little bit the same way as we would do in late April. When we get into those spring cycles and there's a lot of moisture in the snow, wet snow is notoriously difficult to predict in its behavior. And often what we bank on to stay safe in the spring is crust recovery, right? As the top surface of the snowpack refreezes overnight and bridges over all the weakness. And as the day progresses, the crust breaks down, and then the hazard increases as we start to sink deeper and deeper into the wet snow. We start to get worried in the spring when we don't have crust recovery, meaning that the snow on top in the morning is all wet and there's no crust. And this is essentially what we are experiencing right now. So there was no crust on the surface this morning. The forecast for the next few days is still quite warm. So we really have to start thinking about avalanches the same way we would do in late April. So even though the hazard ratings as of today and the forecast for the weekend are in the moderate to low range, it's not necessarily a wide open low where you can do whatever you want. You have to really be mindful of all of that wet snow, especially when you're on rock slabs, steep terrain, bigger terrain, unsupported stuff. That's definitely some areas that you'd want to avoid. Going into the weekend with the weather forecast, it looks like we might have a little bit more clear skies on Saturday, which means that in the afternoon, more melting, more snow, maybe increased hazard, and potentially crust recovery overnight heading into Sunday morning. So forget that we're in January for now. Think of the snowpack the same way you would in late April. When there is no crust and you're sinking really deep into the snowpack, you have to question whether or not you really want to be there if there's any kind of slope to where you are. That's all I have for this week. Stay safe out there, and we'll see you next week.